Montana Territory. Spring of 1883. The train pulled into the dusty station at Fort Benton just past dawn. Steam hissing like the breath of some tired beast, and Thea Vance stepped down onto the platform with a suitcase that had lost a handle and a heart that had lost its home. She was 23, small-boned, with a soft face dulled by years of hard living. Her hands trembled as she clutched the letter that had brought her here, the promise of a new life, a man who wanted a wife, and nothing behind her worth clinging to. Her first husband had died in a factory collapse in New York. The second one hadn't been kind. She had no parents left, no siblings, just bruises fading on her arms and two small children back in the boarding house nursery in town, still asleep. She looked toward the street where a few wagons waited, dust swirling. One man stood apart from the others, leaning against a tall chestnut horse. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a plain buttoned shirt and a hat pulled low, and when their eyes met he stood straight. "Thea?" he asked. "Yes," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He stepped forward slowly like he did not want to startle her. "I'm Malden Dorsey, the cowboy, the one who wrote the letter." She studied him. He was maybe 30, sun-browned and serious, with quiet eyes and a stillness about him that made her stomach twist. Not from fear, from something else, something she had forgotten how to feel. He looked past her to the children. "These yours?" she nodded. "Ruth is 3. Rory just turned 5. He crouched in front of the little boy who was clinging to his sister's hand. "Howdy, Rory," Malden said. "That a toy horse you've got there?" Rory nodded, holding it tight. "Good name for a strong boy," Malden added. Then he stood, glancing at Thea. "Wagons this way. You all must be tired." She followed, her boots stiff with dust, the children silent beside her. She waited for the questions. "What happened to your last husband? Why are you so thin? Can you cook?" But Malden just helped her into the wagon, lifted the children up gently, and sat beside them like this was the most natural thing in the world. The ride was long. Open land stretched out on both sides, hills rolling, the river glinting in the distance. Thea sat stiff, her fingers curled in her skirt. Every bump in the road jostled the children, but Malden had packed blankets and kept handing out dried apples until Ruth fell asleep curled against her lap. "Not what you expected, is it?" Malden asked quietly. She looked at him. "I did not expect anything anymore." He nodded like he understood. "Well, you will not be alone here." The land changed as they neared his homestead, a wide stretch of fenced pasture, a small barn, and a 2-room cabin that looked worn but solid. He helped them down, led them inside. The front room had a stove, a table, and 2 chairs. A curtain hung across the back where a bed sat tucked against the wall. It smelled of cedar and fresh bread. "It is not much," he said. "But there is warmth and quiet and no one here who will lay a hand on you." She froze at that, her throat thick. He turned, embarrassed. "I will sleep in the barn until you are comfortable." "No," she said, surprising herself. "You do not have to. I mean, we can figure it out." He just nodded. "Children need rest and food." He moved to the stove and began heating a pot of beans and cornbread. She watched his hands, steady and sure. A man who did not rush, who did not frighten her. That night, after the children were bathed and fed and asleep on a cot Malden had carried in from the barn, Thea sat at the table, staring at her hands. He poured her a cup of coffee and sat across from her. "I am not good at many words," he said, "but I know what it means to be beaten down. I lost my sister to fever, my father to drink. I built this place with my own hands so I could be somewhere that felt like peace." Thea blinked hard. "I do not know how to be anything but tired." "You will rise with me," he said plainly, "not because I will carry you, but because I will stand beside you." Her lip trembled. She looked down, then back up. "You mean that?" He nodded. "I reckon I do. It was not a love declaration, not yet, but it was more than she had received in her whole life. The days that followed were quiet. Thea cleaned the cabin and mended the curtains. Malden added another cot. The children grew used to the land, chasing chickens and drawing shapes in the dirt with sticks. Rory rode behind Malden on his horse, holding on tight, grinning wide. Ruth sat in Thea's lap at night, brushing her mother's hair with tiny fingers. One afternoon, Thea stood on the porch, watching the sun dip low. Malden came up beside her, wiping his hands on a rag. "Fence is fixed," he said. She nodded. "Children are asleep." He glanced at her, then took off his hat. "You all right?" She swallowed. "I have not felt safe in a long time. You are now." That night she found herself standing outside the barn. Malden was brushing his horse, the lantern flickering on the wooden walls. "You said you built this for peace," she said. He turned, eyes soft. "I think I want to stay," she added. "Not just because I have nowhere else, but because when you say things, I believe you." He stepped closer. "Thea, I have not wanted much in life, but I want you to know. I would not hurt you, ever." "I know," she whispered, and she stepped into him. Not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because her heart had started to remember how to feel safe. She pressed her forehead to his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her slow, like giving her time to pull away. She did not. They stood like that for a long time, breathing the same air, the night quiet around them, and when she finally looked up, he touched her cheek, calloused hand gentle, and said, "You are not broken. You just needed space to breathe." She leaned into his palm. "You make it easy to breathe." The wind stirred the dry grass outside. The stars blinked down. And for the first time in years, Thea let herself hope. Malden did not kiss her that night, but he held her hand all the way back to the cabin. And when they stepped inside, her fingers stayed curled in his, her eyes on his face, because something had started here. Something real, and neither of them wanted to let go. Thea was up before the rooster, standing at the basin with sleeves rolled and her hair pinned rough. A soft fog hung over the fields, and her breath made little clouds in the morning air. She washed her hands slowly, careful not to wake the children still curled on their cot, then stepped outside. Malden was already in the pasture, hat pulled low, checking the calf pen. She hesitated on the porch, not because she feared him, but because crossing that yard meant stepping into a life she still didn't quite know how to carry. Still, she crossed. "You always start this early?" she asked. He didn't look up from the latch he was fixing. "They don't wait," she nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter. "Can I help?" He straightened, brushing dirt from his trousers. "You ever milked before? I can learn." He nodded once, and that was all the invitation she needed. The barn was cool and smelled of straw and warm hide. He showed her how to sit the stool steady, how not to startle the heifer, how to pull gentle and even. Her hands were clumsy at first, but she didn't give up. "You're patient with things," she said, keeping her eyes on the pail. "Things?" he asked. "Me, the children. That gate that wouldn't shut right." He leaned against the post. "Nothing gets better by rushing it." Later, after the chores, she found a pile of worn linens in the trunk beside the bed. She stitched patches into the worst of them while the children played quietly with the wooden animals Malden had carved. Rory lined them up by size. Ruth named them all. That afternoon, when the sun hit the edge of the porch just right, she saw Malden working the corner fence line. A loose post had sunk during the spring thaw, and he was digging it out slow and steady. She brought him water without being asked. "You ever rest?" she asked, handing him the tin cup. He drank deep, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Rest don't come easy when things need doing. Even when no one's watching," he looked at her then. "That's when it matters most." She didn't say anything more, just sat on the edge of the wagon bed while he worked. The wind carried the scent of sage and the soft buzz of bees from the wildflowers along the fence. She closed her eyes and let the stillness settle. As dusk fell, Thea cooked what she could from the stores. He'd kept a bit of salt pork and cornmeal, boiled potatoes. She wasn't proud of the meal, but the children ate without complaint, and Malden didn't leave a scrap on his plate. "We'll need more flour before long," she said, folding her napkin. "I'll take the wagon into town this Sunday. You can come if you'd rather choose things yourself." "I'd like that." He reached for his cup. "You ever been to Fort Benton proper?" "Only the train station. I reckon I'm not used to places that don't smell of smoke or factory grease." He tilted his head. "You'll find this one smells like horses and river mud." She smiled, just a little. That might be an improvement. When night came and the children were tucked in, she washed the dishes while he carved a bit more on a wooden dog for Ruth. The fire popped in the stove and neither of them hurried to speak. "I've been thinking," she said, drying her hands. "Maybe I could tend a garden come planting season. You've the space for it." He nodded. "Soil's good by the creek bend. Gets sun most the day. I'd like to grow carrots." "And onions." She paused, "and something for color, maybe hollyhock." "Hollyhock's a fine flower." She turned, drying cloth still in hand. "You ever had someone plant flowers here before?" "No." She folded the cloth slowly. "Then I'll be the first." His eyes didn't leave her face. "I'd like that." The room held quiet again, but a different kind now. Not the kind born of distance, but the kind that settles when two people start to understand each other. She took a seat across from him, watching the way the firelight softened the angles of his face. "You always live alone?" she asked. He set down the carving knife. "After my mother passed, it was just me. I wrote you because I figured I'd done enough years without a voice in the house. Figured maybe I was ready to share the quiet with someone who needed it." Her voice caught. "I didn't know what I was walking into." "Neither did I." She reached across the table, fingers grazing the edge of his hand. He didn't pull away. "You ever think this might be what folks mean when they talk about starting over?" she asked. He turned his palm up, letting her hand settle into his. "I don't much care for how folks talk, but I reckon this feels like something worth building." She didn't pull away either. They sat like that until the fire burned down low and the only sound was Ruth murmuring in her sleep. When they parted, it was with a promise that didn't need words. In the dark, Thea lay awake on her cot, listening to the breath of her children and the faint creak of wood cooling. She thought of the soil by the creek and a patch of hollyhocks blooming in the sun. She thought of a man who fixed broken gates without being asked. And for the first time since she stepped off the train, she let herself believe she belonged here. Sunday came with a sky so wide it made Thea's chest ache. She tied Rory's boots, checked Ruth's braid twice, and pinned her own bonnet with careful hands. The wagon stood ready, Malden already loading the last of the pelts he planned to trade. His shirt was clean, the buttons all fastened, and he'd trimmed the stubble from his jaw. "You sure you're up to the road?" he asked, lifting Ruth into the seat beside her brother. "I want to choose what we'll carry into the next season," she said. "And the children haven't seen more than this stretch of land since we arrived." He gave a slight nod and offered his hand to help her up. She took it without hesitation. The ride into town was long enough for both children to fall asleep leaning against one another. Malden kept the horses steady, his eyes on the hills ahead. Thea watched the curve of his wrist as he guided the reins, the way his shoulders absorbed the wagon's rhythm. She hadn't asked what he planned to trade for, but she trusted him to know what they needed. When Fort Benton rose ahead through the dust, Thea's breath caught. The river shimmered in the distance, and clapboard buildings lined the Main Street general store, blacksmith, post office, saloon. A group of soldiers passed on horseback, their uniforms dull from wear. She pulled Ruth gently into her lap and pressed a hand to Rory's shoulder. "Stay close," she told them. "No wandering." The general store was dim and crowded. Flour in stacked sacks, jars of pickled beans on the shelves, bolts of calico in a back corner. The shopkeeper, a tall woman with a pinched mouth, looked her over with the kind of judgment Thea had felt her whole life. "Need a ledger to keep track?" the woman asked flatly. "We'll manage," Thea replied, her voice even. Rory clung to her skirt. Malden moved with purpose, setting down a bundle of pelts and asking for salt, coffee, and kerosene. Thea walked slowly, her hands trailing over a tin of yeast, a spool of thread. She paused at a small shelf of paper-wrapped seed packets: turnip, squash, hollyhock. Malden came beside her. "Pick what you want." She ran her thumb across the parchment. "I don't know what'll take root. You'll find out." She chose 3: carrots, onions, and hollyhock. Outside, the sun had risen higher, and the street buzzed with wagon wheels and shouts. A man in a bowler hat gave Thea a long look as they passed. Malden didn't say a word, but he shifted his stance, just enough that the man turned away. They sat at a bench near the blacksmith's, splitting a loaf of sour bread and hard cheese between them. Rory swung his legs, chewing with his mouth full. Ruth kept pulling at the hem of Thea's skirt until Thea finally picked her up and let her rest against her chest. Malden handed Rory a small tin whistle he'd bartered for, not saying a word about it. The sun had begun to lower by the time they headed home. Ruth was asleep again, and Rory blew soft notes on the whistle, stopping each time he caught Malden's eye. Thea leaned back, letting the breeze lift loose strands of hair from her neck. "You didn't ask why I brought the children," she said after a while. "I didn't need to. I thought someone might. I thought someone would ask what kind of woman takes her children to a stranger's land." "You did what you had to." She turned her head. "You always that sure?" He kept his gaze ahead. "I know what it looks like when someone's running. And I know what it looks like when they're ready to stop." The wind gusted across the prairie, and Thea let the silence stretch. "That man who stared at me," she said, "in town. I saw. I've known men like that. I have too." She drew a slow breath. "I don't want to be afraid of every pair of eyes." "You won't be." Back at the homestead, the children were too tired to argue about bed. Thea washed them with warm water she'd set on the stove earlier, then carried Ruth to the cot and tucked the quilt to her chin. Rory was already asleep, the tin whistle tucked under his arm like a treasure. Malden stood outside near the fence, a lantern in one hand. She joined him without speaking, watching as he checked the latch on the gate again, even though it held fine. "I'm not used to being looked after," she said. He didn't turn. "I'm not used to looking after anyone." The lantern cast gold light across his jaw, his collarbone, the line of his neck. She stepped closer, not for warmth, but because it felt right. "I want to know what you're like when it's not all chores and silence," she said. He finally met her eyes. "You'll learn it slow, like everything else on a place like this." "Good," she said. "I want it slow." He set the lantern on the fence post. "Then we'll take our time." She reached for his hand. He didn't flinch. Their fingers laced together, rough skin meeting rough skin. That night she didn't sleep on the cot. She didn't ask permission. She simply stood at the edge of the bed while he folded his shirt and laid it across the chair. He turned and their eyes met. No questions, no apologies. She lay beside him, fully clothed, her back to his chest, and when he placed his hand gently at her waist, she covered it with her own. The wind whistled low outside, but inside the cabin it was still. And in the quiet, Thea didn't dream of running. By mid-May, the snowmelt had dried from the gullies, and the earth warmed enough for planting. Thea knelt in the garden plot behind the cabin, sleeves rolled, palms stained with loam. She pressed onion starts into the softened soil, feeling their roots like thin threads of hope in her grip. Beside her, Ruth sorted seed packets with grave attention, handing them over one at a time like sacred things. "You reckon this one's ready?" Ruth asked, holding out the hollyhock. Thea brushed a curl from her daughter's cheek. "Almost, sweetheart. We'll save that for last. Flowers need a good place to grow." Malden had cleared the plot with a mattock 2 days earlier, pausing only to ask where she wanted the rose. He hadn't said much else, but every morning since, she found the spade leaned against the fence, right where she'd need it. From the barn came Rory's laugh, sharp and light. Malden had shown him how to oil the bridle leathers and let him help clean the wagon wheels with a rag dipped in lye soap. The boy came back at midday with streaks of grease across his arms and a grin that hadn't existed when they'd arrived. Later, after the sun slipped behind the ridge, Thea stepped out to the porch and found Malden sitting on the edge, sharpening his drawknife. His boots were off, feet bare, and his shirt clung damp with sweat from the day's work. She sat beside him, careful not to brush their knees. "You always work past sundown?" she asked. He looked at the blade, turning it in the low light. "Don't like leaving things half-finished." She watched the slow drag of stone against steel. "You ever think about what you'd be doing if you hadn't sent that letter?" He didn't answer right away. The rasp of the sharpening stone slowed. "Maybe I'd have gone on the same, feed the stock, mend what breaks, but it wouldn't have meant much." She turned toward him. And now, he wiped the blade clean with a square of cloth. "Now I've got reason to keep the porch swept," she swallowed, the quiet between them deepening. "I never told you what happened in New York," she said, voice roughened by dust and memory. "Before I came here," he didn't look away, "I worked in a shirtwaist factory. Second husband found me there, said I was wasting myself, promised something better. But he had fists for words. When I left, I couldn't even take my boots." His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak over her. "I thought maybe I was made for suffering." "That maybe some women just are." Malden set the blade down beside him. "You're not." "I know that now," she said, meeting his eyes. "Because of you." She leaned in just enough for her shoulder to touch his. He didn't flinch. Instead, he lifted her hand, turned it palm up and traced the line that ran down the center. "You got hands that belong on this land," he said. "Strong, steady." She didn't pull away. That night, with the children asleep and the moon casting silver through the curtain, she undressed slowly beneath the quilt. Malden stood at the edge of the bed, waiting without reaching. She sat up, the blanket pooling at her lap. "I'm not afraid anymore." He stepped closer. "Not of me. Not of being wanted." He came down beside her, the mattress dipping under his weight. He touched her like she was made of earth, solid, sacred, necessary. No rush, no need to fill the silence. Afterward they lay tangled in the hush of it, the fire down to embers. She pressed her cheek against his chest and felt the strong, slow rhythm under her ear. "You ever think about what comes after a beginning?" she asked. His fingers moved through her hair. "I think it looks a lot like this." The wind shifted outside, rustling the canvas over the tool shed. Inside, everything was still. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't have to. Thea slept with his arm around her waist, her body curved into his, and for the first time in years, her dreams were quiet. Thea stood beneath the cottonwood by the creek, hem muddy, hands damp with spring water. She'd come to rinse the last of the washing, but her eyes had drifted to the sky, instead wide and pale, with clouds stretched thin as gauze. The laundry basket sat full beside her, and Ruth, barefoot in the grass, was threading twigs together like dolls. Rory was up by the barn with Malden, learning how to set a gate brace. She wrung out the last cloth, arms aching, and paused to listen. The low sound of Malden's voice carried on the wind, calm and steady. Rory's laugh followed, short and surprised. the kind of laugh that came from learning something new without being made to feel small for not knowing it. Thea lifted the basket and turned toward the house, Ruth skipping at her side. Inside, she hung the linens in the loft, careful not to wake the hens nesting in the rafters. The warmth of the cabin welcomed her, a stew simmering low on the stove, the scent of dried thyme hanging in the air. By the time the sun dipped low, the gate stood straight again, and Rory had a fresh splinter in his thumb to show for it. Malden pulled him onto the porch and used a needle to ease it out, steady as ever. Thea watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, her mouth curved just slightly. "You were gentle," she said once Rory ran back to the yard. Malden shrugged. "He didn't squirm. You could have barked at him. Some men would have. I'm not some men." She stepped closer, brushing dust from his sleeve. "No. You're not." That evening, as they sat at the table, Rory asked without lifting his spoon, "Is this where we'll always live now?" Malden didn't speak at once. He looked to Thea. She set her hand on the boy's back. "Would you want that?" Rory nodded. "I like it better than the other places." Malden leaned forward. "If you're here, then this is home." After dinner, Thea sat on the porch while Malden finished chopping wood. The axe rose and fell in slow rhythm, each strike clean. She watched the way he moved, not with force but with control, as though the task was part of him. She waited until he stacked the last log. "You ever think about building more?" she asked. He wiped his hands on his trouser leg. "You mean another room?" She nodded, folding her arms. "The children will need space when they're older, and I'd like a place to sew without stepping over boots. I could start framing next week. Got good pine along the north ridge. If you help me pick where the windows go, I'll make sure the light comes in strong." She smiled. "I'd like that." That night, long after the children had gone quiet, Thea sat cross-legged on the bed, mending Rory's shirt by lantern light. Malden sat beside her, sharpening a small hand plane, the shavings curling like ribbon across the floor. "You always work this late?" she asked. "I don't mind it." She set the shirt aside. "I used to think I'd die in a place that forgot my name." He didn't look up. "And now," she turned toward him, "now I have a place where someone says it every day like it matters." He laid the tool down and reached for her hand. "It does." She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, the room warm with the nearness of him. "I never thought I'd want to stay anywhere, but I do here, with you." He pulled her close, pressing his mouth to her temple. "You already have." Weeks passed, and the fields greened with new grass. The garden pushed up shoots, and Rory built a scarecrow from an old coat and straw. Thea began stitching curtains from scrap muslin, and Malden laid plans for the new room, drawing rough lines on the back of a feed sack. One morning, just as the wild roses started to bloom along the creek, a wagon arrived from town with lumber and nails. The driver handed Malden a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Thea opened it on the porch inside, a bolt of blue calico and a letter from the storekeeper, thanking her for mending a torn blanket during their last visit. "I didn't charge her," Thea said, surprised. "You didn't have to," Malden replied. "Sometimes people remember kindness." They built the addition together, Malden swinging the hammer, Thea holding the plumb line, Rory handing up nails from a tin pail. Ruth sat in the wagon bed, singing nonsense songs and pretending to read aloud to her dolly. The work took days, but when it was done, the new room stood solid and bright, with windows facing east. That evening, Thea and Malden stood in the doorway, arms dusted with sawdust. "It'll catch the morning sun," he said. She rested her head on his shoulder. "So will I." 2 months later, they married under the cottonwood, the children standing between them, a circle of wildflowers at their feet. The preacher came from town, and the neighbors brought bread and preserves. It wasn't a grand affair, but it was honest. Thea wore a dress she'd sewn herself, soft and pale like the clouds overhead, and Malden wore the same shirt he'd worn the day he met her. When the vows were spoken, Malden took her hand, and Thea looked into his eyes with nothing held back. He kissed her soft and sure, and the children clapped, and the land around them held its breath, then exhaled. In the years that followed, the cabin grew into a home. The hollyhocks bloomed tall against the fence line. The children ran barefoot through the grass, their laughter familiar as birdsong. The new room was filled with fabrics and quiet mornings. Thea taught Ruth to thread a needle, and Rory learned to ride alone, straight-backed and sure. Malden never stopped rising early. He never stopped coming in at the end of the day with dirt on his hands and a quiet look that said he'd been thinking of her all along. Thea never stopped watching him work, knowing what it meant to be seen, cherished, and never feared. They aged gently together, like wood worn smooth by touch. And every night, with the fire low and the wind brushing the walls, Malden reached for Thea's hand beneath the quilt, their fingers finding each other the way roots find water, deep, steady, and without end.